History wasn't changed by geniuses playing five-dimensional chess. It was changed by tired dudes, bad maps, weird paperwork, and one guy making the dumbest decision possible at the worst possible second. In this video, 44 mistakes that didn't just ruin a day. They rewired borders, empires, wars, and your entire timeline. 1. The First World War was ignited by many complex factors, but the spark that actually blew everything up was a chauffeur taking a wrong turn. After Archduke Franz Ferdinand survived a bomb attack earlier that day, his security team decided to change the route, but nobody bothered to tell the driver. He took a wrong turn down a random street, and when the general started yelling at him to go back, he froze and stalled the car right on the corner. Gavrilo Princip, a frustrated assassin who was standing right there on the street, looked up to see his target served to him on a silver platter. If that car hadn't stalled or the driver knew the city, the entire 20th century might have looked completely different. 2. The Titanic was doomed by many factors, but a huge contributing element was that a guy named David Blair forgot to empty his coat pockets. Blair was originally the second officer but was reassigned right before the ship left port, and in his rush to leave, he accidentally walked off with the only key to the locker holding the ship's binoculars. Because of this one absent-minded mistake, the lookouts in the crow's nest had to rely on their unaided eyes while staring into the pitch-black Atlantic Ocean. By the time they physically saw the iceberg looming out of the darkness, it was too late to turn. One tiny key sitting in a guy's pocket on dry land helped sink the biggest ship in the world. 3. According to popular legend, the Austrian army in 1788 managed to spiral into chaos against itself without a single enemy soldier ever showing up. The story goes that near Carenceves, a group of cavalry scouts bought schnapps from local travelers and refused to share with the infantry. A drunken fistfight broke out, a gun went off, and someone shouted that the Turks were attacking, which caused total panic in the dark. Since the army was a mix of different nationalities, German officers screaming "Halt!" sounded like enemy war cries to the other troops. Accounts say they spent the night firing wildly at each other until the army fled, leaving the confusing mess for the real enemy to find days later. 4. The Kingdom of Italy suffered one of the most shocking European defeats in Africa simply because their generals were bad at reading maps. In 1896, during the invasion of Ethiopia, General Baratieri marched his army into the Battle of Adwa, using a sketch of the terrain where the scale was completely wrong. He thought his brigades were mutually supporting each other, but the bad map led them to drift miles apart in the rugged mountains. The Ethiopian forces, who were smart and well-organized, isolated and crushed the separated Italian units one by one. Italy faced a national humiliation because they didn't double-check their geography homework. 5. The Berlin Wall came down not because of a brilliant political strategy, but because a tired bureaucrat did not feel like reading his memo properly. East German official Günter Schabowski was holding a boring press conference about minor travel updates when he accidentally announced that the borders were open immediately. He was actually supposed to say the new rules started the next morning to give the guards time to prepare, but he mumbled the wrong line live on television. Thousands of people heard it and rushed the checkpoints, overwhelming the confused guards who had no orders to stop them. The Iron Curtain fell because one guy wanted to finish his speech early and go home. 6. Real estate regrets are painful, but nothing tops Tsar Alexander II selling Alaska to the United States in 1867. At the time, Russia thought they were offloading a frozen, useless wasteland that was too hard to defend. They practically begged the Americans to take it for $7 million, which comes out to pennies per acre. The American public even mocked the government for buying an expensive icebox. Fast forward a few decades, and gold was discovered throughout the region, followed by massive oil reserves later on. The US made the purchase price back thousands of times over, while Russia is left looking at the map, realizing they sold a gold mine for absolute pocket change. 7. The Aztec Empire fell rapidly partly because Emperor Montezuma may have hesitated, influenced by omens and politics. According to later accounts, he confused a greedy Spanish conquistador for a returning god. The story claims the deity Quetzalcoatl was supposed to return from the east, and by sheer bad luck, Hernán Cortés arrived at that exact time wearing shiny armor. Instead of mobilizing his massive army to crush the small Spanish force on the beach, Montezuma rolled out the red carpet, invited Cortés into the capital, and gave him gifts of gold. By the time the Aztecs realized these visitors were just here to steal everything, the Spanish had already secured a foothold that would destroy the civilization. 8. Napoleon Bonaparte met his final defeat at Waterloo, and historians suggest a humiliating medical issue might have played a role. On the morning of the battle, the emperor was reportedly in agonizing pain due to a severe case of hemorrhoids, which prevented him from riding his horse to survey the battlefield personally. Instead of his usual dynamic leadership from the front lines, he spent much of the crucial battle sitting on a cushion in his tent, relying on delayed reports from his marshals. His inability to see the field and react to British movements in real time led to tactical errors. The French Empire collapsed partly because the emperor's pain might have cost him his usual edge when it mattered most. 9. King Xerxes of Persia had an ego so massive that he literally declared war on the ocean because a bridge broke. When a storm destroyed his pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, Xerxes flew into a rage and ordered his soldiers to whip the water 300 times as punishment for being rude. He even threw a pair of shackles into the sea to arrest it, and branded the water with hot irons while shouting insults at the waves. It is the ultimate historical temper tantrum, proving that you can rule a massive empire but you still cannot bully the weather into doing what you want. 10. The Australian government in 1932 decided to wage a formal military operation against 20,000 emus, and the birds actually won. Farmers were complaining that emus were eating their crops, so the government sent soldiers armed with machine guns to cull the population. However, the emus proved to be tactical geniuses, scattering in small groups and running faster than the soldiers could aim their heavy weapons. After wasting thousands of rounds of ammunition and crashing their truck, the military was forced to retreat in shame. It might be the only war in history where one side had machine guns and the other side just ran away really fast and still achieved victory. 11. The army of Liechtenstein went to war in 1866 and managed to return home with more men than they left with. During the Austro-Prussian War, they sent out a force of 80 soldiers to guard a mountain pass, where they spent their time avoiding any actual fighting and enjoying the scenery. When the war ended, they marched back to their capital with 81 men because they had made a friend along the way, likely an Austrian officer or a defector who just wanted to hang out. It is the only military campaign in history that suffered -1 casualty, proving that sometimes the best strategy is just to be nice. 12. The Dutch in the 17th century collectively lost their minds and wrecked a lot of fortunes over some pretty flowers. During the height of tulip mania, the price of a single rare tulip bulb skyrocketed to the cost of a luxury mansion on the best canal in Amsterdam. People sold their life savings, land, and businesses just to buy a dirty root that might not even bloom the right color. When the market inevitably crashed, wealthy investors were left holding glorified onions instead of their money. It was one of the first famous financial bubbles in history, fueled entirely by the belief that a flower was worth more than a house. 13. The Swedish warship Vasa was supposed to be the most terrifying weapon in the world, but it ended up being the most expensive submarine in history because the king refused to listen to basic physics. King Gustavus Adolphus ordered a ship that was tall enough to intimidate God and insisted on adding a second row of heavy cannons on the upper deck, even though the shipwrights practically begged him not to because it made the boat top heavy. The king ignored the math because he wanted his floating palace to look cool, so they launched it with massive fanfare. The ship sailed less than a mile, encountered a very gentle breeze, and immediately tipped over and sank. 14. The French Revolution might have ended very differently if King Louis XVI had been able to skip lunch for just one single day of his life. When the royal family was finally escaping Paris in a carriage to start a counter-revolution, speed was the absolute most important factor for their survival, but Louis kept insisting on stopping for breaks. He treated a life-or-death escape mission like a leisurely Sunday family road trip, stopping to chat with locals, stretch his legs, and enjoy lengthy meals with wine and cheese. He was eventually recognized in a small village because he paid with a gold coin that had his own face stamped on it. If he had just packed a sandwich and kept the curtains closed, he might have kept his head. 15. Two massive global superpowers nearly started a devastating international war in 1859, all because a hungry pig decided to eat some potatoes on an island near Seattle. An American farmer named Lyman Cutler shot a pig that was raiding his garden, but the pig belonged to an Irishman who worked for the powerful British Hudson's Bay Company. The British authorities threatened to arrest the farmer, so the Americans sent in the army. And the British responded by sending warships bristling with cannons to stare down 60 guys in a potato patch. For weeks, the two nations were in a tense standoff with guns pointed at each other. The only reason it didn't turn into an actual shooting war is that the British admiral disobeyed orders, saying he would not involve two great nations in a war over a pig. 16. The Confederate Army lost the American Civil War largely because a messenger was too lazy to put a piece of paper in his pocket and decided to use top-secret battle plans to wrap his cigars. General Robert E. Lee had drafted Special Order 191, which detailed the exact movements of his entire army, and sent copies to his commanders, but one copy was dropped in a field in Maryland. A group of Union soldiers taking a break happened to spot a neat little bundle lying in the grass and opened it up hoping for some free tobacco. They were stunned to find the enemy's entire playbook wrapped around 3 cigars, handing the Union general the exact location of every Confederate unit. It is the only time in military history where a smoking habit actually saved the country instead of killing the smoker. 17. Wars typically start over land or religion, but in 1739, Great Britain and Spain went to war specifically because of a pickled body part. A British mariner named Robert Jenkins appeared before a committee in Parliament and reportedly slapped a jar down on the table containing his own severed ear, which he claimed a Spanish Coast Guard had sliced off years earlier. The sight of the floating ear outraged the politicians so much that they declared what was later called the War of Jenkins' Ear. Thousands of sailors died and ships were sunk, all because one guy held onto a grudge and a jar of preservatives for 7 years. 18. The French military in the 1930s built the most expensive club in the world that nobody could get into, but they forgot to guard the side door. The Maginot Line was a super advanced wall of concrete bunkers and tunnels designed to stop Germany forever, but it stopped abruptly at the Ardennes forest because the French generals were convinced that trees were kryptonite to tanks. They looked at the dense woods and arrogantly decided that no army could ever drive through a bunch of leaves and branches. The Germans simply looked at the map, said, "Challenge accepted," and drove their entire armored division through the forest in a couple of days, completely bypassing the wall. The French spent billions on a front door lock while leaving the back window wide open. 19. The Roman Empire could have started the Industrial Revolution almost 2,000 years early, but they treated the steam engine like a cheap party trick. A Greek engineer named Hero of Alexandria actually invented a working steam-powered device called the Eolipile in the 1st century. Instead of realizing they could use this to build trains, factories, or pumps to change the world, the Roman elite just clapped their hands and used it to make automatic doors open at temples to spook the peasants. They had the technology to jumpstart modern civilization, but the smartest guys in the room decided it was much cooler to use it for special effects and toys. Humanity spent the next 17 centuries doing hard manual labor because Rome thought steam was just for entertainment. 20. The Fourth Crusade goes down in history as the worst road trip ever planned, where the map was set to Holy Land, but the drivers ended up sacking the wrong city because they were broke. The Crusaders hired the Venetians to build them a massive fleet, but when the bill came due, the holy warriors realized they had empty pockets. The Venetians, being ruthless businessmen, suggested they could work off the debt by attacking a Christian city instead. One bad decision led to another, and they ended up burning and looting Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the very guys they were originally supposed to help. They destroyed the strongest shield of Christendom just to pay off a boat rental fee. 21. Germany dragged the United States into World War I, largely because their foreign secretary sent the diplomatic equivalent of a risky text message to the wrong person. Arthur Zimmerman sent a top-secret coded telegram to Mexico, basically suggesting that if Mexico attacked the United States, Germany would help them get Texas back. It was a bold and incredibly stupid move, considering the British controlled the telegraph cables and were reading Germany's mail. The British intercepted the note, laughed, and immediately showed it to the Americans. The US public was so furious about the idea of giving up Texas that they abandoned their neutrality and joined the war. Germany essentially defeated itself by trying to secretly recruit Mexico and getting caught. 22. The Dutch accomplished the worst real estate deal in the history of mankind when they traded the future capital of the world for a nutmeg farm. In 1667, the Dutch and the British were fighting over territory, and the Dutch were desperate to keep a tiny, microscopic island in Indonesia called Run because it was the only place where nutmeg grew. To secure their monopoly on this trendy spice, they happily agreed to give the British their colony of New Amsterdam in exchange for keeping Run. The Dutch thought they had scammed the British, celebrating their victory with nutmeg cakes, while the British renamed their new acquisition New York. Today, Run is an obscure island covered in trees, and Manhattan is the economic center of the planet. 23. General Santa Anna lost the entire state of Texas and reshaped North America simply because he wanted to take a nap. In 1836, during the Texas Revolution, the Mexican president and general felt extremely confident after a few victories, so he ordered his army to set up camp in a terrible location near the San Jacinto River. Despite being in enemy territory, he decided that everyone deserved a nice afternoon siesta and failed to post any guards to watch the perimeter. General Sam Houston and the Texan army saw the enemy literally sleeping on the job and launched a surprise attack. The Battle of San Jacinto lasted only 18 minutes before the Mexican army surrendered. Santa Anna woke up from his nap just in time to sign away Texas, proving that oversleeping can cost you half a continent. 24. The Byzantine Empire was destroyed because the emperor tried to save money on a defense budget and insulted the one guy who could destroy him. A Hungarian engineer named Orban approached Emperor Constantine XI and offered to build him the world's most powerful supercannon to defend Constantinople. The emperor, being cheap and broke, refused to pay Orban's salary and essentially told him to get lost. Orban, needing a paycheck, went straight to the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who happily paid him whatever he wanted. Orban built the massive cannons for the Ottomans, and a few months later, those exact guns smashed through the walls of Constantinople. The empire fell because the emperor was too stingy to pay a contractor a fair wage. 25. The charge of the Light Brigade is famous for being brave, but it was actually a massacre caused by a vague hand gesture and a British officer who couldn't communicate. During the Crimean War, Lord Raglan wanted his cavalry to attack some Russian soldiers who were stealing cannons, so he sent a written order that just said to advance rapidly to the front. The messenger, Captain Nolan, rode up to the cavalry commander, Lord Lucan, who asked which guns he was talking about since he couldn't see any. Nolan, annoyed and arrogant, waved his arm vaguely toward the entire Russian army at the end of the valley and shouted that the guns were over there. The cavalry charged the wrong target, riding straight into a valley of death surrounded by enemy artillery, all because an officer was too dramatic with his pointing. 26. The Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day succeeded in establishing a beachhead, partly because the German defense relied on a dictator who liked to sleep in. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as thousands of Allied ships appeared on the horizon, the German panzer divisions were ready to counterattack. However, in practice, key armor moves were tangled in protocol. Hitler was reportedly asleep, and his guards were absolutely terrified to wake him up for any reason. By the time he finally rolled out of bed around noon and gave the order, the window for a counterattack had slammed shut. The Third Reich crumbled because nobody wanted to be the human alarm clock. 27. The music industry changed forever because a record executive had zero taste and a broken crystal ball. In 1962, a scruffy band from Liverpool auditioned for Decca Records, hoping for their big break. The executive in charge, Dick Rowe, listened to their demo and famously rejected them, telling their manager that guitar groups were on their way out and had no future in show business. He sent them packing and signed a local band called the Tremolos instead. That rejected group was the Beatles, who went on to become the biggest band in the history of the universe. Dick Rowe essentially looked at a winning lottery ticket worth billions of dollars and threw it in the trash because he didn't like the font. 28. In the late 19th century, the German company Bayer made a massive pharmaceutical blunder by marketing a new wonder drug as a safe, non-addictive cure for coughs and colds. They named it heroin because it made people feel heroic, and they specifically sold it as a soothing medicine for children with sore throats. For over a decade, doctors prescribed hard narcotics to toddlers before realizing they were creating a generation of addicts. It stands as the single most dangerous marketing campaign in medical history, proving that just because it is in a medicine bottle doesn't mean it is good for you. 29. Western Union could have owned the entire telecommunications industry for peanuts, but they thought talking was a passing fad. In 1876, a struggling inventor named Alexander Graham Bell was desperate for cash and offered to sell his patent for the telephone to Western Union for $100,000. The president of Western Union laughed him out of the room, writing an internal memo stating that this device had too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. He literally called the telephone an electronic toy with no commercial value. A few years later, he realized his mistake when that toy became the most valuable technology on Earth, and he had to spend the rest of his life knowing he passed on the deal of the millennium. 30. Julius Caesar is remembered as a brilliant strategist, but he is also the guy who accidentally torched an insane amount of stored knowledge because he was careless with fire. During a conflict in Egypt, Caesar was trapped in Alexandria and decided to set fire to his own ships in the harbor to create a tactical blockade. It seemed like a solid move until the wind picked up and carried the flames from the docks straight to the warehouses near the Great Library. Thousands of priceless scrolls containing the history, science, and literature of the ancient world were turned into ash. He tried to win a minor naval skirmish and ended up burning down the ancient equivalent of the internet. 31. The United States is stuck using a confusing system of feet and miles today, largely because a group of privateers in the Caribbean stole the solution. In 1793, Thomas Jefferson was actually ready to adopt the metric system, so the French government sent a scientist named Joseph Dombey across the Atlantic with a standard copper kilogram weight to present to Congress. Unfortunately, Dombey's ship ran into a storm and was captured by British privateers, who were more interested in loot than weights and measures. The pirates auctioned off the priceless scientific standard as scrap copper and threw the poor scientist in prison. Because of one unlucky boat ride, American students today still have to memorize that there are 5,280 feet in a mile, instead of just moving a decimal point. 32. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is the most famous architectural disaster on the planet, proving that you should really check the soil before stacking tons of heavy marble. In the 12th century, the engineers in Pisa decided to build a massive bell tower, but they picked a spot with soft, marshy ground composed mostly of clay and fine sand. To make matters worse, they only dug a foundation that was 3 meters deep, which is basically like trying to balance a refrigerator on a waterbed. The tower started sinking and tilting before they even finished the 3rd floor, but instead of starting over, they just kept building at a weird angle for 200 years. It is a miracle of bad planning that became a tourist trap only because gravity decided to be lenient. 33. China was poised to rule the world's oceans in the 15th century, but they decided to burn their own boats because they just didn't like strangers. Admiral Zheng He commanded a massive fleet of treasure ships that were 5 times larger than anything Columbus would sail decades later, capable of reaching Africa and beyond. However, a new emperor came to power who listened to advisors claiming that foreign trade was a waste of money and against traditional values. In a move of spectacular short-sightedness, they dismantled the navy, burned the engineering plans, and closed the borders to focus on building the Great Wall. They voluntarily gave up global naval dominance right before the age of exploration began, leaving the high seas open for Europe to take over. 34. Wars have been fought for gold, religion, and land, But in 1325, two Italian city-states decided to slaughter each other over an old wooden bucket. Tensions were already high between Bologna and Modena, but the breaking point came when some soldiers from Modena sneaked into the center of Bologna and stole an oak bucket from a public well. The Bolognese were so insulted by this petty theft of municipal property that they declared full-scale war and sent thousands of men to retrieve their pail. The armies clashed, Modena won the battle, and they proudly kept the bucket as a trophy of their glorious victory. To this day, that cheap wooden bucket is still on display in a bell tower in Modena, proving that people will fight over literally anything. 35. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, but his entire empire collapsed instantly because he refused to give a straight answer on his deathbed. When his generals gathered around the dying king and asked who should inherit his massive kingdom, Alexander simply whispered, "To the strongest." This was the worst possible thing he could have said, because every single general in the room believed they were the strongest one there. Instead of a peaceful transition of power, his vague last words triggered 40 years of chaotic squabbling and political infighting where everyone tried to grab a piece of the pie. He spent his life uniting the world only to break it apart with his final breath because he wanted to be dramatic. 36. The Russian Navy in 1904 went on the absolute worst cruise in history and almost started a war with Britain because they were hallucinating. The 2nd Pacific Squadron was sailing through the North Sea on their way to fight Japan when the nervous crew spotted some silhouettes in the fog. Even though Japan was literally halfway across the planet, the Russians decided these were enemy torpedo boats and opened fire with everything they had. It turned out they were fiercely attacking a fleet of unarmed British fishing trawlers who were just trying to catch some cod. The Russians were so bad at aiming that they missed most of the fishing boats, but managed to shoot their own ships in the confusion. They nearly caused a global diplomatic crisis because they were scared of a few fishermen. 37. The Great Fire of London. In 1666 burned down 13,000 houses, largely because the mayor was grumpy about being woken up from a nap. When the fire first started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, it was small and easily containable, so the firefighters called for the Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, to give permission to demolish a few buildings to create a firebreak. Bloodworth arrived, took one look at the flames, and is said to have joked that a woman could extinguish it by peeing on it, before going back to bed. He refused to order the demolition because he didn't want to pay for the damages. By the time he woke up again, the wind had picked up, and the entire city was an inferno, proving that you should never hit the snooze button during an emergency. 38. A printing company in 1631 managed to accidentally rewrite the Ten Commandments and turn the Bible into a totally different kind of book. The royal printers Robert Barker and Martin Lucas were rushing to publish a new edition of the King James Bible when they made a tiny but catastrophic typo in the 7th commandment. They forgot the word "not," so the text commanded readers that, "Thou shalt commit adultery." This version became known as the Wicked Bible, and it essentially told the entire population that cheating on their spouses was a divine order from God. The king was absolutely furious, fined the printers a fortune, and ordered every copy to be burned, but a few survived as a testament to the importance of proofreading. 39. Mansa Musa of Mali was the richest man who ever lived, but he accidentally shook up an entire country's economy just by being too generous on a road trip. When he went on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold with him that he started handing it out like candy to everyone he met in Cairo. He gave fistfuls of gold to beggars, shopkeepers, and officials, thinking he was doing a good deed. However, he flooded the market with so much free cash that gold instantly lost its value, causing massive hyperinflation that sent prices sideways for years. He is the only tourist in history who was so rich that his tips literally bankrupted the country he was visiting. 40. The Eiffel Tower is the pride of France, but in 1925, a scrap metal dealer actually bought it because he was too embarrassed to admit he didn't know how government works. A smooth-talking con man named Victor Lustig invited a group of metal merchants to a secret meeting and convinced them that the city of Paris was too broke to maintain the tower and wanted to sell it for scrap. One dealer, André Poisson, was so desperate to join the big leagues that he handed over a suitcase full of cash without asking any follow-up questions. When he realized the Eiffel Tower was not actually being taken down, he was so humiliated by his own stupidity that he fled the country instead of going to the police. Lustig got away with selling a national monument that he didn't own. 41. The Kingdom of Scotland lost its independence and was forced to merge with England primarily because they were absolutely terrible at retail sales. In the late 17th century, Scotland invested nearly half of the nation's entire wealth into the Darien scheme, a plan to establish a trading colony in the tropical jungles of Panama. The planners were so clueless about the destination that they filled the ships with heavy wool socks, thick blankets, and wigs to sell to the indigenous tribes living in a rainforest near the equator. Surprisingly, the locals had zero interest in wearing winter clothes in 100-degree heat, and the colony went bankrupt. Scotland was so broke from this shopping error that they had to sign the Act of Union to get a bailout, meaning the United Kingdom exists today because someone tried to sell sweaters in a jungle. 42. The USS William D. Porter goes down in naval history as the most incompetent ship to ever set sail, mostly because it almost assassinated the American president by accident. In 1943, the destroyer was escorting the battleship Iowa, which was carrying Franklin D. Roosevelt to a secret summit. During a routine drill, the crew meant to simulate firing a torpedo, but the torpedo man forgot to remove the firing primer, and a live torpedo actually shot out of the tube straight at the president's ship. Panic ensued as they had to break radio silence to scream a warning, and the Iowa barely turned in time to avoid the explosion. The ship was in deep trouble, proving that you should really double-check the safety switch when the commander-in-chief is in the splash zone. 43. The Roman Empire reached the peak of political absurdity in the year 193 when the Praetorian Guard decided to sell the entire government to the highest bidder like it was a used car. After the previous emperor was removed, the elite soldiers didn't have a backup plan, so they literally stood on the ramparts of the camp and announced an auction for the throne. A wealthy and ambitious senator named Didius Julianus yelled out the highest price, promising 25,000 sesterces to every single soldier, and was instantly declared the ruler of the known world. He bought the title of emperor simply because he had the biggest wallet, but his reign only lasted 66 days before the actual army arrived to ask for a refund. 44. The most humiliating military defeat of the 19th century didn't involve cannons, but a ridiculous swarm of rabbits. Napoleon's chief of staff arranged a rabbit hunt to celebrate a treaty but made the fatal mistake of buying tame farm rabbits instead of wild ones. When the cages were opened, instead of running away in fear, a whole army of rabbits assumed it was feeding time and charged straight at the emperor. Napoleon was swarmed by a cloud of fur climbing his legs and jacket, forcing the most powerful man on the continent to flee in his carriage, while his generals tried to fight off the rabbits with riding crops. So yeah, the world you live in is basically a museum of human errors. Now here's the fight starter. Which mistake on this list should be taught in schools as the one idiot who cost us everything? And why? Pick one, defend it like your life depends on it, and roast everyone else's pick in the replies. Like and subscribe if you enjoy watching history get bullied.